So this is part 2 of generics for Java. And just before we actually start getting onto the code, I just want to go through a couple of brief points that the reason we're actually using generics. So it's commonly understood in programming terms that the earlier bug is spotted in the code, the easier and ultimately cheaper it is to fix. And that's because there's less resources and less manpower invested to actually fix that error. So if a bug appears in production code, production here means that code that has been released to the Google Store or it's commercially available, or it's not test code anymore. It has to be fixed. There's no doubts about it that for most bugs, so some minor bugs that perhaps you wouldn't need to fix, but ultimately, if it's in production mode, it must be fixed. And so as well as fixing it, the code itself must be then fully tested to ensure that the actual fix you made didn't in fact introduce another bug. And then of course, finally, the updated code containing the fix or fixes has to actually be redeployed and uploaded to the Google Store or whichever Android app store you're actually using. And so any system, so that's any other apps that rely on the program, they too have to be tested to ensure that the fix hasn't broken interoperability between the two systems. Now, if the bug itself is spotted in testing, the effort's actually reduced slightly, but there's still a requirement for any tests that previously passed to be performed again. And of course, if the bug is spotted at compile time, no one else actually notices except you, the programmer, and the fix has had very low impact on everyone else. So that's the reason why you want to get these errors fixed early in your code. You don't want to find all these surprises, bugs later in the process, because particularly with larger applications, and when you're involving other resources, other people, it starts costing a lot of money, if nothing else, in programmers' salaries and time to actually fix those errors. So basically what I'm getting at here is that it follows that anything we can do to pick up these bugs at compile time when we're actually writing our code the first time is well worth the effort to get right. So in the previous video, I showed you how generic types can be used and how they're actually very useful to ensure that we don't produce a program that compiles fine but actually gives us errors at runtime. And I used the example there of actually adding a string to what was an array list that we assumed only contained integers. So let's actually have a look at taking that to the next step, and that's actually creating our own generic classes. Now, what I'm going to use for this example is the concept of adding players to various types of sporting teams. So to begin, we need to actually create some basic classes. So let's start off creating the basic abstract class. We come down here as we've always done and create the new class. So I'm going to do a new class. It's going to be an abstract class called player. So I'm going to make that an abstract class player, and we're going to have a string which will be the player name. We're going to add a constructor which will be name, so we can actually create the object and just a getter as well for the actual player name as well. Very basic class for our player. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create 3 types. We're going to create a baseball player for baseball, a football player as in Australian rules football, and a soccer player as in soccer, which is what in Australia we call football, if that makes sense. Football for UK people. So I know that sounds a bit confusing, but that's what we call them over here in Australia. So I'm going to create those classes. First one's going to be baseball. Baseball player, I'm going to call it. And the baseball player is going to extend from player. So we need to create a constructor to pass that through so the actual name is stored, because that field is actually in the player class. So there's our baseball player. Let's create the football player. So football player. That's also going to extend from player. And we also need to create the constructor for that, so it's happy with that as well. And lastly, let's create the soccer player class. So soccer player. And we need to extend from player. Then we also need to create the constructor like so. So that's our 3 classes. There's nothing generic about those at this stage. But what we're going to do now is create a team class, and in that team class, add the ability to actually add players. So let's go ahead and do that. Create a new Java class. We're going to call it team. Now we're not extending from anything else because this is a base class. So we're going to have a name, and then this is the name of the team as opposed to the name of the player. So private string name. And we're going to keep this simple. We're going to just track the played, number of games played, number won, number tied, and number lost. So I'm going to put int played equals 0, int won equals 0, int lost equals 0, and int tied equals 0. Now obviously in a real application you'd have to deal with fixtures and those sorts of things. We're going to keep it pretty basic as they're just with a basic number of fields. So we're going to create an array list that's using generics for our player object. So we're going to type private array list, and it's going to be of type player. Remember, player is our abstract class that all the other three classes extend from. And we're going to call that members. So this is members of the team equals new array list. And I'm going to remove that by default. We're probably getting an error about the level. So I need to make sure I've set the correct level up. So you may not get that error, but if you do, go to project structure and make sure that the project language level is set to 1.8. So I'm going to click on OK. And you can see that error then disappeared when I did that. So we need a constructor now. Constructor is going to just have the name, team name, passed to it and saved. And we also want a getter for the team name as well. So we'll just use just that one, the getter for the name. Now we come to the part where we're actually going to add the player. So we're going to have an option to allow us to do that. So I'm going to type public Boolean. And Boolean will be whether we successfully added them or not. Add player. Player. So player is the abstract class definition, remember, that we can pass to this. We can put if members contains player. And we can put message player dot get name plus is already on the team, so we're not going to allow a duplicate or duplicates. And then we're going to return false in that case. Otherwise, we're going to do add it, so members.add player, and we're going to put the player name again, player dot get name plus picked for team plus this dot name. This dot name is the actual team name, and we're going to return true in that case because we successfully added it. You can see that's now a method, add player, and we're accepting the parameter of player, which is actually going to enable us with one call to actually pass a baseball player, football player, or a soccer player. And we're able to do that because we're using an abstract class, and obviously we're using a generics here for the array list definition of type player. So continuing on, we also need a getter, and the getter is going to return the number of players on the team. So I'm going to put public int num players, and that's just going to return the size of the array list. So this dot members dot size, like so. Okay, so next we're going to actually create a method that actually gives us a result, what actually happened with the team, whether we won or lost. So I'm going to put public void match result, pass team opponent, int our score, int their score. Instead of actually having to pass whether we won or lost, we'll get the method within this team class to actually determine that. So we can put if our score is greater than their score, 1++, because we obviously won the game, else if our score is equal to their score, tied ++, else we obviously lost, because that's the only other potential option. And then we increase the number of games played. And then, interestingly enough, we put if opponent is not equal to null, opponent dot match result, null, their score, our score. So we're doing it this way now, so we can actually also update the opponent score. And when we basically call this opponent match result again, we're passing null this time, so that this doesn't get executed again. So this way we're actually saving our results for our team, but we're also saving the results in the opponent's team as well, saving the results in their sort of object, their separate object. So that's the match results. And finally, we want a ranking. So we'll just come up with some sort of ranking system that's pretty simple. So let's do ranking, public int ranking, return. Let's just do our ranking to be number of games won multiplied by 2 plus tied. Now that's obviously just one way of doing it. There's thousands of different ways of rankings, and you could actually implement this dependent on the actual class itself. But we're just keeping it simple for now. So now that we've actually got the base code in place, we can actually start creating various types of teams and adding players. So let's go to the main method and start that. So we could start by putting football player Joe equals new football player Joe, and say baseball player Pat equals new baseball player Pat, and soccer player Beckham equals new soccer player Beckham, even though I think he's retired. Okay, and team, so let's try typing team Adelaide Crows, the team I follow, equals new team Adelaide Crows. And we can put Adelaide Crows dot add player Joe, Adelaide Crows dot add player Pat, and Adelaide Crows dot add player Beckham. Now why Beckham would be playing for AFL, I don't know, but anyway, that's an aside. And we can print that out now just to make sure that the basic thing is working. Adelaide Crows dot num players. We should get the right result if we do that. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to stop the video here. In the next video, we'll actually tackle this problem. This is the problem of actually making sure that a particular team will only accept a player of the correct type. So in this case, if we actually specify a team, then we only allow the correct people who are part of that team, in other words, a football player in this scenario for the Adelaide Crows, to be accepted as part of that team. So we'll do that in the next video.